On March 3, 2023, Dr. Marcus Webb, a 48-year-old pediatrician at Riverside Children's Medical Center in Portland, Oregon, was arrested for the sexual abuse of 4 patients over a period spanning 12 years. The highly respected physician, who had been named Pediatrician of the Year by the Oregon Medical Association in 2019 and served on multiple hospital ethics committees, had systematically abused children as young as 6 years old while using his medical authority and the trust inherent in the doctor-patient relationship to ensure their silence. Webb's crimes began with inappropriate touching during routine examinations and gradually escalated to more serious sexual offenses, creating a pattern of abuse that would only be discovered when one brave teenager finally spoke up to a school counselor. The details of the case shocked Portland's medical community and the thousands of families who had entrusted their children's care to a doctor they believed represented the pinnacle of pediatric medicine. Before we continue with this disturbing case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light that might otherwise remain hidden. The investigation revealed that Webb had perfected a system for identifying and isolating vulnerable children, particularly those from immigrant families with limited English proficiency who were less likely to report abuse or navigate the complex medical complaint system if they did. He strategically used follow-up appointments and special testing procedures as opportunities to be alone with his chosen victims, creating seemingly legitimate reasons for extended one-on-one examinations that wouldn't raise suspicions among nursing staff or parents. His private examination rooms at Riverside Children's Medical Center, located in a specialized wing designated for sensitive procedures, became the primary site of the abuse, though investigators would later discover that Webb had also taken advantage of after-hours situations and hospital call duties to access vulnerable patients. The isolation of these children, physically, emotionally, and linguistically, was deliberate and calculated, investigators would later conclude. As one of Portland's most prominent pediatricians, Webb had cultivated an impeccable reputation among patients, colleagues, and the broader medical community. His partners in the Riverside Pediatric Group described him as brilliant and deeply committed to underserved populations, often volunteering his time at free clinics and advocating for expanded healthcare access for immigrant children. Parents specifically requested him as their children's doctor, drawn by his credentials from Johns Hopkins Medical School, his published research on childhood developmental disorders, and his seemingly genuine warmth with young patients. Webb's public persona was that of a dedicated physician and father of 3, active in medical education and frequently invited to speak at conferences about pediatric care best practices. This carefully constructed facade allowed him to operate without suspicion for over a decade, even as he methodically selected and groomed his victims. The abuse followed a pattern that prosecutors would later describe as textbook predatory physician behavior. Webb would identify vulnerable patients, typically children from immigrant families, particularly those from Southeast Asian and Latin American communities whose parents had limited English skills and unfamiliarity with American medical norms. He would then create medical justifications for repeated examinations, ordering tests that required him to conduct extensive physical assessments while engineering situations where parents were asked to wait in the lobby or were momentarily absent from the examination room. The doctor used a combination of medical authority, psychological manipulation, and exploitation of cultural deference to physicians to ensure his victims' compliance and silence. He told children that the examinations were normal medical procedures, that their parents had consented to everything he was doing, and that questioning a doctor's judgment could result in their families being reported to immigration authorities, a particularly effective threat for families with undocumented status. The gleaming glass and steel structure of Riverside Children's Medical Center rose above Portland's southeast waterfront, a state-of-the-art facility that had opened in 2010 with the mission of providing world-class pediatric care to Oregon's diverse communities. Inside those walls, the sterile corridors and child-friendly waiting areas decorated with colorful murals and interactive displays presented a facade of safety and healing that masked the systematic abuse taking place in Dr. Marcus Webb's examination rooms on the 3rd floor. Webb's office was decorated with children's artwork, medical school diplomas from Johns Hopkins, and photographs of the doctor on medical mission trips to Guatemala and Vietnam, creating an image of a compassionate physician dedicated to helping vulnerable populations, ironic signposts of virtue that stood in stark contrast to his predatory actions. Parents bringing their children for routine checkups, vaccinations, and sick visits never imagined they were delivering them into the hands of a predator who had carefully calculated how to exploit the power imbalance inherent in the physician-patient relationship. The scope of Webb's crimes became apparent only after 16-year-old Maya Nguyen finally disclosed the abuse to her high school counselor after years of carrying the burden alone. The disclosure came during a health education unit on consent and bodily autonomy, which triggered memories and emotions Maya had been struggling to suppress. Initially hesitant and frightened about the potential consequences for her family, she eventually revealed a history of abuse that had begun when she was 9 years old, during treatment for chronic asthma, and had continued through numerous follow-up appointments over a 7-year period. Her detailed account would serve as the foundation for the investigation, leading detectives to identify other potential victims and ultimately building a case that exposed the full extent of Webb's predatory behavior. Maya's courage in coming forward would later be credited with preventing countless other children from suffering similar abuse and exposing dangerous vulnerabilities in medical oversight systems. The rain-soaked streets of Portland seemed to mirror the darkness of the community's response, as news of Webb's arrest spread through local and national media. Parents gathered in shocked clusters in hospital parking lots and outside the Riverside Pediatric Group offices, trying to process the possibility that their children might have been exposed to or victimized by a doctor they had explicitly chosen because of his stellar reputation. Hospital administrators hastily organized emergency town hall meetings to address parents' concerns and outline the steps being taken to support patients and cooperate with the ongoing investigation. The Oregon State Police established a dedicated hotline for the case, which quickly became inundated with calls from current and former patients and their families. The city of Portland, despite its reputation for progressive values and social awareness, suddenly felt vulnerable as the case dominated local conversation and residents confronted the reality that such crimes could occur within their most trusted institutions. Webb's abuse had continued uninterrupted, despite a complaint raised by a parent 5 years before his arrest, a critical failure that would later become a central focus of both the criminal case and subsequent civil litigation. The parent, concerned about Webb's insistence on examining their daughter without a parent or nurse present during what should have been a routine wellness check, had approached both the hospital's patient relations department and the Oregon Medical Board with their concerns. Those concerns were investigated in what the medical board later acknowledged was an inadequate manner, with Webb providing explanations about the examination techniques that were accepted without independent verification or consultation with other pediatric specialists. No disciplinary action was taken, no formal complaint was filed in Webb's medical record, and he was not required to modify his examination practices or undergo additional supervision. This institutional failure to act allowed Webb to continue abusing children for 5 more years before Maya Nguyen's disclosure finally triggered a proper investigation that would expose the full scope of his crimes. Maya Nguyen was just 9 years old when she first became a patient of Dr. Marcus Webb at Riverside Children's Medical Center, a bright and curious child who had been diagnosed with moderate persistent asthma following several emergency room visits for respiratory distress. The youngest of 3 children in a Vietnamese immigrant family, Maya's parents worked long hours at their family restaurant in Portland's Jade District, often relying on their oldest daughter to translate during medical appointments when scheduling conflicts prevented both parents from attending. Her family situation, marked by language barriers and her parents' limited familiarity with American medical systems, created precisely the type of vulnerability that Webb had learned to identify and exploit over his years of predatory behavior.
By the end of her first month as Webb's patient, Maya had been scheduled for multiple follow-up appointments to monitor her asthma progression, a medically justifiable reason for frequent visits that provided Webb with regular access to his new victim. The city of Portland, with its verdant parks and progressive reputation, formed the backdrop to Maya's childhood, a landscape that prided itself on inclusivity and child welfare, while somehow failing to protect her from a predator operating within its medical establishment. On the surface, her life appeared normal. She participated in school activities, maintained excellent grades despite the language challenges her parents faced at home, and had a small circle of friends at Wilson Middle School. Inside, however, she was increasingly isolated, carrying a burden that separated her from her peers and family, much like the isolated pockets of immigrant communities that exist within Portland's increasingly gentrified neighborhoods. The abuse occurred primarily in afternoon appointments, when Webb's schedule was less busy and nursing staff were occupied with other patients or administrative tasks, creating legitimate-seeming windows of time for extended examinations that wouldn't raise immediate suspicions. The calculated nature of these encounters, scheduled during times when Webb had deliberately kept appointment slots relatively open on his calendar and in examination rooms equipped with doors that locked from the inside, reflected his understanding of the medical center's routines and staffing patterns. As the abuse continued and escalated over the 7 years Maya remained Webb's patient, she withdrew into herself, developing coping mechanisms that allowed her to compartmentalize her experiences and continue functioning. Her academic performance became inconsistent, particularly in subjects requiring sustained concentration, which Webb paradoxically leveraged during appointments by expressing medical concerns about whether her asthma medications might be affecting her cognitive function, concerns that justified additional examinations and testing.
Sleep disturbances, nightmares about doctor visits, and psychosomatic symptoms before scheduled appointments became regular occurrences, though they were attributed by her well-meaning but medically unsophisticated parents to her underlying asthma condition rather than recognized as potential signs of abuse. Maya began avoiding medical settings entirely, once hiding in a restaurant storage room for hours to miss scheduled appointment, behavior that her parents interpreted as typical adolescent resistance to authority rather than a desperate attempt to protect herself. The young girl's deteriorating emotional state was masked by her developing ability to present a facade of normalcy, a skill common among childhood trauma survivors, particularly those from cultures that emphasize not bringing shame to the family. The psychological impact of the abuse manifested in increasingly concerning ways as Maya progressed through middle school under Webb's continued medical care. She developed obsessive behaviors around personal hygiene, showering multiple times daily and expressing discomfort with any form of physical contact, even from family members. Drawings in her school notebooks became darker and more symbolic, filled with images of locked doors and figures with exaggerated eyes, imagery that should have raised red flags, but was instead interpreted by her art teacher as reflecting the moody aesthetic common in adolescent artistic expression. Relationships with peers became strained as Maya found it increasingly difficult to participate in typical adolescent conversations about crushes and physical development, topics that triggered intense anxiety connected to her experiences in Webb's examination rooms. The isolation that resulted from these changes only served to further Webb's control, as Maya became increasingly dependent on her abuser for validation about her health and well-being. Within the sprawling urban landscape of Portland, Maya's family lived in a modest apartment above their restaurant in the Jade District, where the smell of pho and jasmine rice filled their home and Vietnamese remained the primary language of daily life. Her parents, working 15-hour days to maintain the business that represented their American dream, were rarely available during Maya's waking hours outside of school, creating gaps in supervision and emotional support that Webb expertly exploited. He offered to see Maya for appointments during school hours when her parents couldn't close the restaurant, positioning these visits as accommodations for a hardworking immigrant family rather than opportunities to isolate his victim without parental oversight.
The family struggle to establish themselves in Portland's competitive restaurant industry, marked by razor-thin profit margins and the constant fear of business failure, created precisely the type of economic vulnerability that Webb targeted in his selection of victims. Maya's parents, grateful for what appeared to be an exceptional doctor's dedication to their daughter's health, never questioned the frequency of appointments or Webb's insistence on examining Maya without their presence in the room, practices he justified with medical terminology they didn't fully understand and cultural frameworks about respecting professional authority that made questioning him feel inappropriate. By the time Maya entered high school, she had endured 7 years of escalating abuse that had fundamentally altered her sense of self, her understanding of her own body, and her relationship with authority figures, particularly in medical contexts. The transition to a larger, more anonymous high school environment initially offered some relief, as her asthma had improved to the point where less frequent medical monitoring was required, reducing the regularity of her contact with Webb. However, the psychological effects of the abuse continued to manifest in her behavior and emotional responses, including panic attacks triggered by the smell of hand sanitizer, and an aversion to medical settings so severe that she avoided the school nurse's office even when genuinely ill. It would take 2 more years and a mandatory health education unit on consent and bodily autonomy for Maya to begin processing what had happened to her and considering the possibility of disclosure. The health education curriculum, recently updated to include explicit discussions of medical consent and the fact that patients have the right to refuse examinations or request chaperones, provided Maya with language and concepts that helped her recognize that Webb's behavior had violated her rights and crossed professional boundaries. This recognition, while painful and complicated by years of conditioning to believe the abuse was normal medical care, was the first step toward breaking the silence that had protected her abuser for so long. Maya's decision to disclose the abuse to her school counselor, Miss Jennifer Rodriguez, on March 1, 2023, came after weeks of internal struggle and mounting anxiety that occasionally manifested in panic attacks severe enough to send her to the school nurse, the very office she had previously avoided. The disclosure itself was halting and incomplete, beginning with vague statements about feeling uncomfortable about past doctor visits, and gradually progressing to more specific revelations as Rodriguez responded with belief and support, rather than the skepticism Maya had feared. The conversation, which began in Rodriguez's small office overlooking the school's courtyard and continued through the lunch period, was punctuated by long silences and tears as Maya struggled to find words for experiences she had been told were normal medical procedures, but that had left her feeling violated and ashamed. Rodriguez, a licensed counselor with 15 years of experience working with adolescent trauma survivors, recognized immediately that Maya's disclosure described not boundary-crossing medical care, but systematic sexual abuse disguised as medical examination. By the end of the day, Rodriguez had contacted Oregon's Department of Human Services Child Protective Services Division and the Oregon State Police, setting in motion the investigation that would ultimately expose Webb's decade-long pattern of abuse. The courage required for Maya to break her silence cannot be overstated, particularly given Webb's careful reinforcement of the idea that his examinations were medically necessary, that her parents had consented to everything, and that questioning his medical judgment could have serious consequences for her family's immigration status, a particularly insidious threat given the Nguyen family's position in Portland's Vietnamese immigrant community. When Maya Nguyen finally disclosed the abuse she had endured, she could not have anticipated the wave of consequences that would follow, both the painful process of investigation and legal proceedings and the eventual validation of her experience through Webb's conviction. The Oregon State Police Criminal Investigation Division, located in a utilitarian government building in Salem, where persistent Oregon rain tapped against windows overlooking the Willamette Valley, became intimately familiar to Maya and her parents in the weeks following her disclosure. Detective Sarah Mitchell, of the OSP Criminal Investigation Division was assigned to the case within hours, given the seriousness of the allegations and the fact that they involved a licensed physician with access to thousands of vulnerable children. Mitchell, a 20-year veteran specializing in crimes against children, approached the initial forensic interview with Maya using trauma-informed techniques she had developed over her career, creating a safe environment in a specialized interview room at the Child Advocacy Center, where soft lighting and comfortable furniture helped ease the visible terror of the 16-year-old, whose voice rarely rose above a whisper as she began to share her account of abuse that had started 7 years earlier. The persistent Portland drizzle seemed to intensify as Detective Mitchell listened to Maya's disclosure, her halting description of how Webb had used medical authority and parental absence to create opportunities for abuse over a 7-year period. The detective's experienced eye noted the classic signs of medical professional abuse in Maya's account. Webb's selection of a child from a family with language barriers and cultural unfamiliarity with American medical norms, the progressive boundary violations framed as necessary medical procedures, and the combination of professional authority and subtle threats used to ensure silence. Maya's disclosure included specific details that lent credibility to her account: the layout of Webb's examination rooms where most of the abuse occurred, the particular medical justifications Webb would use for requesting parental absence from examinations, and the progression of the abuse from inappropriate touching, disguised as medical palpation, to more serious sexual offenses. The foundational clue that would drive the investigation forward was Maya's detailed account of how Webb used the medical system's procedures and the inherent power imbalance between physician and patient to create opportunities for abuse, a pattern that could potentially be corroborated through medical records, appointment schedules, and witness testimony from other medical staff. Detective Mitchell's interview with Maya Nguyen revealed the calculated nature of Webb's abuse, painting a picture of a predator who had weaponized his medical degree and professional reputation to access and control vulnerable children. Maya described how Webb would deliberately schedule her appointments during quieter afternoon periods, when nursing staff were less likely to interrupt examinations, claiming this allowed him to give her the thorough attention her complex asthma case required. The doctor also insisted on conducting certain examinations without parental presence, using medical jargon and appeals to patient privacy rights that Maya's English-learning parents felt unqualified to challenge. Mitchell recognized these as classic isolation tactics used by predators in positions of professional authority, designed to create private access to victims while maintaining a facade of medical legitimacy. The detective made detailed notes of this pattern, recognizing it as a potentially crucial avenue for corroborating Maya's account and identifying other possible victims through examination of appointment scheduling patterns and nursing staff observations. The sprawling metropolitan area of Portland, with its distinct neighborhoods radiating from the downtown core and bridges spanning the Willamette River, presented unique challenges for the investigation as Mitchell began the process of building a case against Webb. Riverside Children's Medical Center sat in the city's southeast quadrant, a gleaming facility serving families from across the metro area and beyond. Mitchell's first visit to the hospital came the day after Maya's disclosure, her unmarked sedan pulling into the visitor parking lot as afternoon rain began to fall, sending staff members hurrying between buildings with umbrellas and lab coats pulled over their heads. The detective presented her credentials to the hospital's security desk, requesting a meeting with Chief Medical Officer Dr. Patricia Holbrook, who appeared visibly shaken when informed of the nature of the investigation. The CMO, a gray-haired woman in her early 60s who had recruited Webb to Riverside's pediatric department 12 years earlier, led Mitchell to her office through hallways decorated with cheerful murals of animals and children, the child-friendly environment of the hospital contrasting sharply with the darkness of the allegations the detective was there to discuss. The initial conversation between Detective Mitchell and Dr. Holbrook revealed the first institutional failure that had allowed Webb's abuse to continue unchecked. When questioned about any previous complaints or concerns regarding Webb's behavior with patients, Holbrook hesitated before acknowledging that a parent had filed a complaint with the hospital's patient relations department approximately 5 years earlier, expressing discomfort with Webb's insistence on conducting examinations without parental presence and without a chaperone nurse. The CMO admitted that the hospital had conducted an internal review that consisted primarily of asking Webb to explain his examination procedures, which he had justified with references to research on adolescent patient comfort and privacy during sensitive examinations. The review committee had accepted Webb's explanations without consulting independent pediatric experts about whether his practices aligned with professional standards, had not required him to modify his procedures or work under enhanced supervision, and had not reported the complaint to the Oregon Medical Board as potentially required under mandatory reporting statutes. Mitchell's demeanor remained professional, but her questioning intensified as she requested immediate access to Webb's personnel file, patient appointment records for the past 12 years, nursing staff schedules showing which nurses worked with Webb on different days, and any documentation of the previous complaint investigation. The Oregon rain was falling steadily as Mitchell left the hospital with the first batch of records, the gray skies seeming symbolic of the dark secrets hidden within the facility's bright, cheerful walls. The investigation accelerated rapidly in the days following Maya's disclosure, with the Oregon State Police assigning additional detectives from the Criminal Investigation Division to assist Mitchell as the potential scope of Webb's crimes became apparent. Detective Marcus Johnson was tasked with reviewing the medical records and appointment schedules obtained from Riverside Children's Medical Center, looking for patterns in Webb's patient selection and appointment timing that might corroborate Maya's account and identify other potential victims through an examination of appointment scheduling patterns and nursing staff observations. A forensic accountant examined Webb's financial records, looking for unexplained expenses or unusual patterns that might connect to the abuse allegations. The coordinated effort reflected the state police's understanding of the seriousness of the case and the potential for multiple victims spanning Webb's 12-year career at Riverside. Detective Johnson's analysis of medical records quickly confirmed the pattern Maya had described, showing that Webb had a disproportionately high percentage of patients from immigrant families, particularly Vietnamese and Latino communities, compared to other pediatricians at Riverside who served a more demographically diverse patient base. The record showed that certain patients, including Maya, had been scheduled for follow-up appointments at much higher frequencies than standard pediatric care protocols would typically indicate, often with medical justifications in the chart notes that seemed questionable when reviewed by the consulting pediatric expert the state police had retained. Appointment timing analysis revealed that Webb had a pattern of booking these frequent flyer patients during afternoon time slots when nursing staff schedules showed fewer personnel on duty in the pediatric wing, creating the reduced supervision opportunities Maya had described. The Portland afternoon rain streaked down the windows of the state police building as Johnson compiled a list of 38 patients who fit the vulnerability profile over the past decade, prioritizing them for contact and potential interviews based on the frequency of their appointments, the medical justifications documented, and the extent to which their family situations matched the vulnerability characteristics Webb appeared to target. The initial phase of the investigation also involved careful planning for how to approach Dr. Marcus Webb without alerting him to the full scope of the investigation, allowing detectives to observe his reactions and potentially recover evidence before he had opportunity to destroy it. Detective Mitchell decided on a strategy of requesting Webb's voluntary cooperation with what she would initially frame as a routine patient complaint investigation, scheduling an interview at Oregon State Police Headquarters for March 6, 2023. Simultaneously, search warrant applications were being prepared for Webb's office at Riverside Children's Medical Center, his home in Portland's wealthy West Hills neighborhood, and his digital devices, based on the evidence compiled from Maya's testimony and the corroborating patterns identified in medical records. The Oregon rain fell steadily over Portland as the detectives finalized their approach, the city's lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk as investigators prepared to confront a predator who had hidden behind the white coat of medical authority for over a decade. On the morning of March 6th, as gray clouds hung low over the Willamette Valley, Detective Mitchell met with the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office to brief prosecutors on the case and ensure all legal requirements for the investigation were being met. Assistant District Attorney Catherine Reynolds, assigned to lead the prosecution if charges were filed, reviewed the evidence gathered thus far and approved the search warrant applications for Webb's properties. Reynolds, known for her meticulous preparation and successful prosecution of complex abuse cases, asked pointed questions about the timeline of Maya's disclosure, the hospital's inadequate response to the previous complaint, and the potential for additional victims based on the patterns emerging from the medical records. The collaboration between law enforcement and prosecutors this early in the case reflected the seriousness with which all parties viewed the allegations and their commitment to building a case that could withstand the scrutiny of trial, particularly given that Webb would undoubtedly retain high-powered defense attorneys and expert witnesses to challenge every aspect of the prosecution's case. The meeting concluded with a coordinated plan for the next phase of the investigation, including protocols for interviewing potential victims using forensic interview techniques specifically designed for medical abuse cases and preserving evidence that might corroborate their accounts. The Portland morning remained overcast and drizzly as Mitchell and her partner, Detective Park, drove to Oregon State Police headquarters in Salem for Webb's scheduled interview, aware that this would likely be their only opportunity to question the doctor before he retained legal counsel and ceased cooperating with the investigation. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at the Oregon State Police headquarters at 2 p.m. on March 6th, driving himself in his silver Tesla Model S and appearing confident and slightly annoyed at having been asked to take time away from his medical practice for what he'd been told was a routine complaint investigation. The afternoon rain had intensified, drumming against the roof of the utilitarian government building as Webb was escorted to an interview room where Detective Mitchell was waiting. The doctor, tall and distinguished-looking with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carried himself with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, an attitude that would shift dramatically as the interview progressed. Mitchell began with routine questions, establishing Webb's background, his medical training at Johns Hopkins, his 12 years at Riverside Children's Medical Center, and his general approach to pediatric care. Webb responded with practiced eloquence, describing his commitment to underserved populations and his particular interest in treating children from immigrant families who often lacked adequate healthcare access. The detective noted his smooth presentation, the professional photographs of his 3 teenage children prominently displayed on his phone when he checked it briefly, and the Medical Association awards and community service recognitions he mentioned casually, all elements of the carefully constructed image that had allowed him to operate without suspicion for so long. As the gray Portland afternoon deepened outside the interview room's small window, the questioning shifted from general background to more specific inquiries about Webb's examination practices. Mitchell observed subtle shifts in Webb's body language as the questions became more pointed. The slight tightening of his jaw when asked about his policy of conducting examinations without parental presence, the increased rate of his blinking when questioned about his high frequency of follow-up appointments for certain patients, and the defensive edge that entered his voice when Maya Nguyen's name was first mentioned. Webb maintained that his examination practices were entirely appropriate and followed standard pediatric protocols, explaining that adolescent patients often felt more comfortable discussing sensitive health matters without parents present, and that building trust through regular appointments was essential for managing chronic conditions like asthma. His voice remained steady as he denied any improper physical contact with patients, but Mitchell noted that he frequently qualified his statements with phrases like,
to the best of my recollection and consistent with standard medical practice, creating linguistic distance from absolute denials. The foundational clue of Maya's disclosure loomed unspoken in the room, informing every question the detective asked while she gathered preliminary responses from Webb that could later be compared to the evidence being collected through other avenues of the investigation. As the interview progressed into its third hour, Mitchell introduced evidence of the complaint that had been filed 5 years earlier regarding Webb's examination practices with a different patient. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle outside as Webb's composure showed its first significant crack, a momentary widening of his eyes, an involuntary intake of breath before he regained control. His response represented a tactical shift, acknowledging that he vaguely remembered some current concern being raised, but maintaining that it had been investigated by the hospital and fully resolved, with his practices vindicated by the review committee. This partial admission represented an attempt to create an alternative narrative that could explain away certain behaviors while still denying any criminal intent or action. Mitchell noted this shift in approach, recognizing it as a classic defense mechanism of acknowledging to lesser issues when confronted with evidence too strong to deny completely. The detective deliberately allowed Webb to develop this narrative, knowing that these partial admissions could be compared against more comprehensive evidence still to be presented, potentially revealing additional inconsistencies that would undermine his credibility. The psychological pressure intensified as Mitchell revealed that multiple patients with similar profiles to Maya, immigrant families, high frequencies of appointments, examinations without parental presence, had been identified through the medical record review. The Portland evening had fully fallen outside the interview room, the fluorescent lighting now the only illumination, creating a harsh environment that seemed to mirror the increasingly inescapable nature of the evidence being presented. Webb's carefully maintained composure began to fracture more noticeably, with visible perspiration on his forehead, despite the room's cool temperature, and his hands gripping the arms of his chair with increasing tension. His responses became more defensive and less coherent, shifting between claims that cultural differences might lead immigrant families to misinterpret normal medical care and suggestions that he was being unfairly targeted because of his work with vulnerable populations. Mitchell observed these escalating signs of distress without comment, allowing the mounting evidence to create psychological pressure while continuing to project calm professionalism that contrasted sharply with Webb's growing agitation. The turning point in the interview came when Mitchell presented Webb with specific allegations from Maya's account, descriptions of examination procedures that went far beyond legitimate medical care, the frequency and duration of appointments that couldn't be medically justified, and the pattern of ensuring parental absence during these encounters. The detective carefully observed Webb's reaction as she described the consistent patterns across multiple patients' experiences, the selection based on family vulnerability, the medical justifications that didn't align with standard pediatric protocols, the insistence on privacy during examinations, and the use of medical authority to ensure silence. Webb's facade of professional indignation finally began to crumble, replaced by visible signs of panic, as he realized the extent of the case building against him. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his gaze shifting between Mitchell and the door as if calculating escape options, and his previous articulate responses devolved into fragmented denials and attempts to end the interview. The dramatic shift in demeanor was being captured by recording equipment and noted meticulously in Mitchell's report, providing valuable evidence of consciousness of guilt that would later be presented to the jury. As the interview entered its fourth hour, Mitchell shifted tactics, moving from presentation of evidence to direct confrontation about Webb's underlying motivations. The night had deepened over Salem, the Oregon rain continuing its steady pattern against the windows, while inside the interview room, Webb sat with shoulders hunched, the earlier confidence completely abandoned. The question about motivation triggered a response that surprised the detective, not a confession, but a rambling justification in which he characterized himself as providing compassionate, thorough medical care to vulnerable children whose parents' cultural backgrounds and language barriers sometimes led to misunderstandings about appropriate medical examination techniques.
He spoke of the special challenges of treating immigrant families and suggested that what might appear inappropriate to outsiders was actually culturally sensitive, thorough medical care. This narrative, while still avoiding direct admission of the sexual nature of his actions, revealed the distorted thinking common to predators who rationalize their abuse as beneficial or necessary. Mitchell recognized this as valuable insight into Webb's psychology and potential testimony from expert witnesses who could explain to a jury how such cognitive distortions typically function in cases of medical professional sexual abuse. The final phase of the interview focused on Webb's awareness of professional boundaries and medical ethics, with Mitchell directly referencing the Hippocratic Oath and pediatric professional standards regarding appropriate examination procedures. The Oregon night was at its darkest outside, the rain having picked up again. While inside the interview room, Webb faced the reality that his carefully constructed professional identity was collapsing under scrutiny. The doctor's response to questions about professional ethics marked a significant moment as his expression shifted from defensive self-protection to what appeared to be genuine distress. He made a statement about how the pressures of modern medicine and the emotional demands of caring for vulnerable children can sometimes blur professional boundaries. A comment that, while falling short of confession, represented an implicit acknowledgement that boundaries had been crossed. This moment of apparent recognition, captured on recording and documented in the detective's notes, would later be contrasted with expert testimony about how predators often attempt to reframe their abuse as arising from professional dedication or emotional connection rather than acknowledging predatory intent. As the interview concluded near midnight, Webb was informed that he was free to leave, but should expect further contact as the investigation continued. Mitchell had deliberately avoided arresting Webb at this stage, wanting to execute search warrants and conduct additional victim interviews before taking him into custody. As Webb left the state police building, walking into the Portland rain toward his expensive car, Mitchell completed her detailed report of the interview, highlighting the key moments that revealed consciousness of guilt, the partial admissions that contradicted earlier denials, and the psychological insights gained into Webb's selection of victims and rationalization of his behavior. The aftermath of Webb's interview reverberated through the investigation, as details were shared with prosecutor Catherine Reynolds and her team at the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. The Oregon morning brought continuing rain, gray skies stretching across the Willamette Valley as Reynolds reviewed the interview transcript and video, noting the key points that would strengthen their case at trial. Webb's nonverbal reactions when confronted with evidence, his shifting explanations, and his eventual acknowledgement that professional boundaries might have been blurred provided valuable material for the prosecution's narrative about the deliberate nature of his crimes. Reynolds met with Detective Mitchell in her office, where rain streaked down the windows overlooking downtown Portland's Courthouse Square, as they discussed the psychological insights gained during questioning and how they aligned with expert analysis of medical predator behavior patterns. The interview had confirmed their understanding of Webb's calculated targeting of vulnerable immigrant families and his exploitation of his position of medical authority, while also revealing the cognitive distortions he used to rationalize his actions, all elements that would be crucial in presenting a compelling case to the jury about the deliberate nature of his crimes. The investigation's next critical phase involved executing search warrants on Webb's properties before he had opportunity to destroy evidence. Early on the morning of March 7th, teams of Oregon State Police detectives and forensic technicians converged simultaneously at 3 locations: Webb's office at Riverside Children's Medical Center, his home in Portland's affluent West Hills neighborhood, and his private vehicle. The searches yielded immediate results that strengthened the case significantly. At his medical office, investigators discovered a locked file cabinet containing handwritten notes about certain patients that went far beyond normal medical documentation. The notes, organized in folders with patients' names, included detailed information about family situations, parents' work schedules, English language proficiency levels, and immigration status, information that appeared focused on identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities rather than providing medical care. Maya Nguyen's file contained observations about her parents' limited English skills, their demanding restaurant schedule that made afternoon appointments convenient, and notes about Maya's developing adolescent reluctance to have parents present during examinations, elements that Webb had apparently identified as making her an ideal target for abuse disguised as medical care. In Webb's home office, a hidden safe behind a medical textbook bookshelf contained a disturbing collection that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. Inside were patient photographs that had been taken during what Webb claimed were medical documentation purposes, but which focused inappropriately on certain children in ways that violated medical photography ethics. The images, while not explicitly pornographic, demonstrated an unusual level of attention to specific patients and revealed a pattern of documentation that served Webb's personal interests rather than legitimate medical purposes. Also discovered were several small items: a bracelet, a hair clip, a small toy, each carefully preserved in individual plastic bags with dates and initials written in Webb's handwriting. These appeared to be souvenirs or trophies from his victims, a behavior pattern commonly observed in serial predators. Most damningly, investigators discovered a password-protected digital file on his personal laptop that contained a journal spanning nearly 10 years. Once the password was cracked by the state police's digital forensics unit, the journal revealed entries that documented Webb's selection process for victims, his techniques for isolating them during appointments, and his rationalizations for his actions. While the entries were carefully worded to avoid explicit admission of criminal conduct, they clearly expressed inappropriate fixation on certain young patients and detailed planning for creating opportunities to be alone with certain children. These coded references, investigators would later determine, corresponded to dates and times of appointments with Maya and other victims, suggesting a systematic record-keeping of his abuse. As the investigation continued analyzing the evidence collected from Webb's properties, Detective Park focused on contacting former patients identified through medical record analysis as having spent unusual amounts of time in one-on-one appointments with the doctor. The Portland rain continued its steady rhythm against her vehicle's windshield as she drove through the city's diverse neighborhoods, conducting preliminary interviews with former patients and their families. These interviews required extreme sensitivity, as Park needed to gather information without leading potential victims or creating false memories, while also being alert to signs that might indicate unreported abuse. The breakthrough came 4 days into this process when Park interviewed the family of 12-year-old Leanne Tran, who had been Webb's patient for 5 years. Initially hesitant and anxious, Leanne eventually disclosed a pattern of abuse, strikingly similar to what Maya had described, including the progression from seemingly routine examinations to clearly inappropriate touching, the medical justifications Webb provided for examining her without her parents present, and the same implicit threats about immigration consequences if she questioned his authority. Leanne's disclosure, coming independently and without knowledge of Maya's statement, provided crucial corroboration of the pattern of abuse and strengthened the case exponentially. The persistent Oregon rain seemed to expose every secret as a third victim emerged during the second week of the investigation. Sophia Morales, now 15, who had been Webb's patient 6 years earlier during treatment for childhood diabetes, came forward after seeing a news report about Webb's suspension from medical practice pending investigation. Sophia's disclosure came after experiencing severe panic attacks triggered by the news coverage, which prompted their parents to seek emergency counseling. The consistency across all 3 victims' accounts was striking. Each described how Webb had targeted them based on their family's limited English proficiency and unfamiliarity with American medical norms, isolated them through medical justifications that their parents felt unqualified to question, gradually escalated the abuse over time, and used his position of medical authority combined with subtle immigration-related threats to ensure their silence. All 3 victims reported Webb telling them that the examinations were standard medical procedures that all doctors performed, that their parents had consented to everything, and that questioning a physician's judgment could result in their families being reported to immigration authorities or losing access to medical care. The 3 disclosures, spanning different time periods throughout Webb's tenure at Riverside Children's Medical Center, established a clear pattern of predatory behavior that had continued uninterrupted for at least a decade, suggesting the strong possibility of additional victims who had not yet come forward or who might never report due to continued fear or shame. The evidence against Marcus Webb mounted as the Digital Forensics Unit completed their comprehensive analysis of his electronic devices, discovering encrypted folders containing concerning materials and communications that revealed his deliberate targeting of vulnerable families. Emails between Webb and medical interpreters at the hospital showed him specifically requesting information about which families had the most limited English skills and the least familiarity with American healthcare systems, ostensibly to provide culturally competent care, but actually to identify the most vulnerable potential victims. The metadata on photographs of patients found on his devices showed that he had been systematically documenting certain children for years, with timestamps that often corresponded to the extended appointment times recorded in hospital scheduling systems. Most damningly was the password-protected journal recovered from his laptop that contained entries describing his feelings towards specific patients in language that, while carefully avoiding explicit admission of physical contact, clearly expressed inappropriate attraction and detailed planning for creating opportunities to be alone with certain children. These digital breadcrumbs reinforced the pattern described by the victims and provided additional evidence of premeditation and calculated behavior that would be crucial for prosecution.
As the case against Webb solidified, the investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of the institutional failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Detective Mitchell conducted follow-up interviews with Riverside Children's Medical Center administrators and the Oregon Medical Board officials who had handled the complaint from 5 years earlier, focusing on how those concerns had been investigated and why they had been dismissed without meaningful action. The Oregon rain seemed particularly heavy during these interviews, conducted in administrative offices where windows offered views of the hospital's modern architecture, a building designed to heal children, but which had instead provided cover for systematic abuse. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, the hospital's chief medical officer, admitted under persistent questioning that the complaint investigation had been inadequate, consisting primarily of accepting Webb's explanations without independent verification, consulting outside experts, or implementing any enhanced supervision or monitoring of his practices. The investigation revealed that the hospital had been more concerned with protecting its reputation and avoiding potential liability than with thoroughly investigating potential abuse. No formal complaint had been filed with the Oregon Medical Board despite requirements in state law, and no meaningful changes had been made to examination room policies or chaperone protocols that might have prevented future abuse. This institutional failure represented a critical missed opportunity to intervene that might have prevented 7 more years of abuse, including the victimization of Maya, Leanne, and Sophia. The Oregon State Police conference room buzzed with activity as the investigative team assembled all the evidence gathered against Dr. Marcus Webb. The walls were covered with timelines, photographs, and connection maps that painted a damning picture of calculated predatory behavior spanning over a decade. Detective Sarah Mitchell led the meeting, her normally calm demeanor intensified by the gravity of the case and the clear pattern that had emerged across multiple victims. The evidence board told the story of a physician who had systematically identified vulnerable children from immigrant families, created medical justifications for repeated examinations in private, and used his position of authority to facilitate abuse and ensure silence. Medical records showing appointment patterns were cross-referenced with family demographic information, revealing Webb's clear preference for patients from families with limited English proficiency and uncertain immigration status. Physical evidence recovered from his home and office, the hidden souvenirs, the coded journal, the inappropriate photographs, provided tangible support for the victim's accounts. Digital evidence from his devices demonstrated his deliberate targeting of vulnerable families and inappropriate fixation on certain young patients in his care. As the meeting concluded, the decision was unanimous. There was more than sufficient evidence to arrest Marcus Webb for multiple counts of sexual abuse of minors, with the expectation that additional charges would follow as the investigation continued and more victims potentially came forward. The morning of March 14, 2023, dawned gray and rainy, characteristic of Portland's early spring weather. Detective Mitchell arrived at Marcus Webb's home in the West Hills just after 6 a.m., accompanied by 4 uniformed Oregon State Police troopers and representatives from both the Oregon Medical Board and the hospital's legal department. The detective had timed the arrest for early morning when Webb would be home and before he departed for his medical practice, wanting to execute the arrest warrant at his residence to minimize public spectacle while ensuring he had no opportunity to flee. The Webb home was an impressive modern structure of glass and natural wood perched on a hillside with views across Portland to Mount Hood in the distance, a visible symbol of the success and respectability Webb had achieved while secretly abusing vulnerable children entrusted to his care. Mitchell rang the doorbell as dawnlight began to filter through the persistent rain clouds, and Webb answered in a bathrobe, his expression shifting from confusion to resignation as he saw the assembled officers and understood immediately why they had come. The detective formally placed him under arrest,
reading his Miranda rights as uniformed troopers placed handcuffs on his wrists, the metallic click echoing in the quiet morning as the facade of the respected pediatrician finally crumbled under the weight of justice. Webb said nothing beyond acknowledging that he understood his rights, maintaining a stoic silence as he was led to a waiting police vehicle, his wife standing in the doorway in shocked silence as neighbors began emerging from their homes to witness the dramatic scene. In the weeks following Marcus Webb's arrest, the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office assembled a formidable case against the former pediatrician, with Assistant District Attorney Catherine Reynolds taking the lead on what had become the highest-profile medical abuse case in Oregon's recent history. Reynolds, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for thorough preparation and unwavering commitment to child victims, worked closely with Detective Mitchell to organize the substantial evidence into a compelling narrative that would leave no doubt about Webb's guilt. The two met regularly in Reynolds' office in the Multnomah County Courthouse, a historic building in downtown Portland where rain frequently obscured the views of the Willamette River. The walls of the conference room they used were soon covered with timelines, medical records, and witness statements, a visual representation of the case they were building against a man who had exploited his medical degree and professional reputation to victimize vulnerable children in his care. The prosecution's theory of the case crystallized around Webb's deliberate targeting of vulnerable immigrant families, with Reynolds developing a clear narrative of how the doctor had weaponized his position of medical authority to identify, isolate, and abuse his victims. Medical records obtained through extensive subpoenas revealed that Webb had consistently requested assignment of patients from immigrant communities, positioning this as cultural competency and dedication to serving underserved populations, when in reality it provided access to children whose families' language barriers and unfamiliarity with American medical systems made them less likely to report abuse or successfully navigate the complaint process if they tried. The Portland rain glared through the courthouse windows as Reynolds analyzed appointment scheduling patterns spanning Webb's 12-year career at Riverside. Noting the disproportionate number of follow-up appointments and special monitoring visits assigned to children from immigrant families, particularly those with limited parental English proficiency. The pattern was so consistent that it could not be coincidental, and when cross-referenced with Webb's emails requesting information about families' language skills and cultural backgrounds, it painted a damning picture of premeditation and calculated selection of victims based on their vulnerability. The investigation into Webb's methods of isolating his chosen victims yielded particularly compelling evidence of his calculated approach to creating opportunities for abuse. Detective Mitchell's thorough examination of hospital procedures and staffing patterns revealed that Webb had deliberately scheduled high-risk patients during afternoon time slots when nursing staff were stretched thin, covering multiple units, reducing the likelihood of nurses being available to serve as chaperones during examinations. The Oregon rain seemed to bear down on the investigation team as they mapped the examination room layout, identifying how Webb had positioned furniture to block sight lines from the door's window, installed a secondary lock on the interior door that wasn't standard in other examination rooms, and kept medical equipment arranged in ways that required patients to be positioned with their backs to the door.
Webb had also manipulated hospital policies regarding parental presence, citing research on adolescent patient privacy and comfort to justify routine requests that parents wait in the lobby during examinations of children as young as 7 or 8, ages at which most pediatric standards would require parental or chaperone presence during any examinations involving disrobing. These tactical decisions demonstrated a level of planning and calculation that would be crucial in establishing the predatory nature of Webb's behavior and countering any defense suggestion that the allegations were the result of misunderstandings or normal variations in medical examination techniques. The prosecution's case was significantly strengthened by the recovery of Webb's coded journal and medical notes, which a team of forensic linguists and medical experts had been called in to analyze, given the sophisticated way Webb had disguised his predatory intentions using medical terminology and euphemistic language.
The journal recovered from Webb's home computer contained entries spanning nearly a decade that, once properly decoded and interpreted, revealed a disturbing record of his inappropriate fixation on certain patients and his strategic planning for creating opportunities to abuse them. The Portland rain cast a melancholy atmosphere over the forensic laboratory, where experts worked to fully interpret Webb's writings, eventually producing reports that documented a clear pattern of victim selection, grooming, and abuse that aligned perfectly with the accounts provided by Maya, Lien, and Sophia. Most damning were Webb's notes about his victims' vulnerability factors. Detailed observations about their families' limited English skills, parents' work schedules that made supervision difficult, and cultural factors that made families less likely to question medical authority. These records provided a window into Webb's methodical approach to selecting and abusing children in his care, and established a clear timeline of escalating behavior that corresponded exactly with the accounts provided by the identified victims. The investigation into the institutional failures that had enabled Webb's continued access to vulnerable children focused particularly on the complaint that had been filed and dismissed 5 years before his arrest. Prosecutor Reynolds obtained all documentation related to parent Thomas Chen's complaint about Webb's insistence on examining his daughter Jessica without parental presence during what should have been a routine wellness check. The Oregon rain seemed to highlight every word of Chen's detailed written complaint as Reynolds read it in her office, noting his specific mention of his daughter's discomfort with Webb's examination techniques, the unusual duration of the appointment, and Jessica's reluctance to return to Webb for follow-up care. The hospital's investigation file revealed a troubling pattern of inadequate inquiry and premature closure. The review had consisted of a single meeting with Webb during which he provided explanations about examination protocols that were accepted without verification from pediatric professional associations, consultation with independent experts, or interviews with other patients or nursing staff who might have observed concerning patterns. Holbrook's written response to Chen had dismissed his concerns as arising from cultural differences and expectations about medical privacy, and assured him that Webb's practices were consistent with contemporary pediatric standards, assertions that subsequent investigation revealed were demonstrably false. Most troublingly, the hospital had not filed a mandatory report with the Oregon Medical Board, despite state law requirements that healthcare facilities report any complaint involving potential sexual misconduct by a physician, regardless of the outcome of internal investigation. This documented failure to follow legal reporting requirements became a crucial element in establishing the systemic negligence that had allowed Webb to continue abusing children long after clear warning signs had emerged. The psychological literature on medical professional sexual abuse provided crucial context for understanding Webb's behavior, and the prosecution team worked extensively with expert witnesses who could help explain to a jury how physicians who abuse patients typically operate. Dr. Robert Chen, a forensic psychiatrist specializing in professional misconduct cases, reviewed all the evidence and victim statements, identifying the classic patterns of medical abuse present in Webb's approach. Dr. Webb exhibited textbook predatory physician behavior, Dr. Chen explained during the case preparation meeting, the Portland afternoon rain visible through the office windows behind him. He exploited the inherent power imbalance in the physician-patient relationship, used medical authority to frame abuse as legitimate care, and specifically targeted victims whose cultural background and language barriers made them less likely to recognize boundary violations or successfully report them. Dr. Chen noted that Webb had used his legitimate medical expertise to create sophisticated cover for his abuse, documenting fake medical justifications for examinations in patient charts, using proper medical terminology to describe procedures that were actually abusive, and hiding behind the presumption of professional competence that society grants to physicians. This expert analysis would be crucial in helping the jury understand the sophisticated nature of Webb's grooming process and why the abuse had gone undetected for so long despite occurring in a modern medical facility with professional staff and supposedly robust oversight systems. The case-building process solidified further when financial investigators uncovered evidence of Webb's efforts to ensure continued access to vulnerable populations outside his main medical practice. Bank records revealed that Webb had made substantial donations to community organizations serving immigrant families, consistently volunteering for free clinic programs that gave him access to children from the most vulnerable populations. The Oregon rain seemed to illuminate the patterns in the financial documents spread across Detective Mitchell's desk, revealing how Webb had positioned himself as a champion of immigrant health access, while simultaneously creating additional opportunities for potential abuse beyond the already limited oversight of his regular practice. He had served as volunteer medical director for a community health fair targeting Vietnamese families, had provided free consultations at a Latino community center, and had established a scholarship program specifically supporting immigrant children interested in healthcare careers. Activities that had further enhanced his reputation as a dedicated advocate while providing him with access to vulnerable children whose families trusted him implicitly due to his public service. The calculated nature of these efforts strengthened the prosecution's portrait of Webb as a predator who had methodically created a public persona specifically designed to facilitate and conceal his abuse of the vulnerable populations he claimed to serve. As the case-building process continued, prosecutors faced the challenge of preparing the young victims for the difficulty of testifying about their traumatic experiences in court. Victim advocate Maria Santos worked closely with Maya, Leanne, and Sophia, helping them understand the court process and develop coping strategies for managing the intense emotions that would arise when facing their abuser in a courtroom setting. The Portland rain provided a soothing background sound in the child-friendly meeting rooms where Santos used age-appropriate language and activities to explain concepts like cross-examination, objections, and the importance of telling the truth even when questions became confusing or uncomfortable. The victims participated in mock court sessions, practiced breathing techniques for managing anxiety, and worked with specialized trauma therapists to process the complex feelings of shame, fear, and anticipated guilt that Webb had worked so hard to instill in them through his manipulative framing of the abuse as normal medical care they had consented to. Reynolds observed these sessions, noting the strength and resilience demonstrated by Maya, Leanne, and Sophia, despite the trauma they had endured, becoming increasingly determined to ensure that Webb would face the full consequences of his actions and that his victims would see their truth validated through the justice system.
By the time the Multnomah County grand jury convened in April 2023, the prosecution had assembled an overwhelming case against Marcus Webb, presenting evidence that led to an indictment on 48 felony counts, including first-degree sexual abuse, using a child in a display of sexually explicit conduct, sexual misconduct with a minor, and unlawful sexual penetration. The Oregon spring had brought intermittent sunshine breaking through the persistent clouds as Reynolds presented the grand jury with medical records showing Webb's pattern of targeting vulnerable patients, physical evidence recovered from his home and office, digital evidence from his devices, and testimony from Detective Mitchell summarizing the statements of the 3 identified victims. The indictment represented the culmination of the initial investigation and case-building process, though Reynolds made clear that the investigation remained active as additional potential victims continued to come forward following news coverage of Webb's arrest. The charges carried a potential sentence of over 150 years if convicted on all counts, reflecting the severity of Webb's crimes and the devastating impact on multiple victims whose families had trusted him with their children's health care. As the indictment was returned, setting the stage for trial in the Multnomah County Circuit Court, the full weight of the case against Marcus Webb came into focus. A damning portrait of a predator who had exploited his position as a trusted physician to systematically abuse vulnerable children entrusted to his care, hiding behind the white coat of medical authority while violating the most fundamental principle of medicine: first, do no harm. The moment of Marcus Webb's arrest, that decisive click of handcuffs closing around his wrists in the doorway of his expensive West Hills home, marked the beginning of a new phase that would reverberate throughout Portland's medical community and beyond. Detective Sarah Mitchell led Webb to the waiting police vehicle as a light rain fell, typical of Portland's spring weather, while Webb's wife stood frozen in the doorway and neighbors emerged from their homes to witness the shocking scene. The early morning light illuminated Webb's face as he was placed in the back seat, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes revealing fear beneath the surface. Students heading to school stopped to stare as the police vehicle drove past, carrying away the doctor many of them had seen for annual checkups and vaccinations, creating a wave of confusion and whispered speculation that would spread through Portland's East Side neighborhoods within hours. Webb remained largely silent during the processing at the Multnomah County Detention Center, asking only whether he would be allowed to contact his attorney and whether the charges would be made public. Questions that revealed his primary concerns about legal representation and reputation management, rather than the well-being of the children he had harmed. This affect, described by multiple booking officers as unusually detached, given the serious nature of the charges, would later feature prominently in psychological evaluations introduced during his trial. The interrogation of Webb at Oregon State Police Headquarters on the day following his arrest provided additional insights into his psychological state and his approach to defending himself against the allegations. The interview room was deliberately austere, a small space with cinder block walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and uncomfortable plastic chairs as the only furniture. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, intensified by the gray daylight filtering through a small, high window as persistent Oregon rain continued outside. Webb sat with perfect posture despite having spent the night in county jail, his prison jumpsuit incongruous with his normally professional appearance, and declined the offer of water or coffee. His earlier shock seemed to have been replaced by a calculated composure that Detective Mitchell recognized as defensive preparation. Detective Mitchell and Detective Park positioned themselves across from Webb, recording equipment capturing every nuance of what would become a 6-hour session. The detective began with procedural questions, confirming Webb's understanding of his Miranda rights and his decision to speak without his attorney present, a decision that surprised the investigators, given Webb's intelligence and presumed understanding of the legal system. Webb explained that he had nothing to hide and wanted to clear up these tragic misunderstandings before they destroyed his career and family, language that revealed his continued belief that he could talk his way out of the situation through the force of his professional credentials and persuasive abilities. As the questioning shifted to the specific allegations against him, Webb maintained a posture of professional indignation mixed with patient explanation, as though he were teaching medical students about a complex clinical concept, rather than defending himself against accusations of child sexual abuse. The Portland rain intensified against the small window as Mitchell methodically presented evidence: Maya's disclosure, with its specific details about examination room procedures, the pattern of appointment scheduling targeting immigrant families, the coded journal entries recovered from his laptop. The detective noted Webb's physical reactions to each piece of evidence: the slight tremor in his hands when Maya's detailed account was described, the increased rate of blinking when confronted with his own journal writings, and the defensive crossing of his arms when shown the inappropriate photographs recovered from his home safe. Despite these subtle tells, Webb maintained verbal denials that he characterized as correcting serious misunderstandings about culturally sensitive medical care. He explained at length about the challenges of providing healthcare to immigrant populations, the importance of building trust through regular appointments, and the necessity of conducting thorough examinations without parental presence when treating adolescents with sensitive health concerns. His explanations were delivered with the confident authority of someone accustomed to having his professional judgment accepted without question, revealing his continued belief that medical expertise would shield him from accountability. The interrogation strategy shifted as Detective Park introduced specific details from Leon Tran's independent disclosure, directly challenging Webb's assertion that Maya's allegations arose from cultural misunderstandings. The afternoon rain created a rhythmic background sound as Park described how Leon's account corroborated Maya's in striking detail. The same examination techniques that went far beyond legitimate medical care, the same medical justifications for parental exclusion, the same implicit threats about immigration consequences. Webb's composure showed its first significant fracture, a momentary widening of his eyes, a sharp intake of breath, and visible tension in his shoulders before he regained partial control.
His response represented a tactical evolution, acknowledging that he might have patients from similar cultural backgrounds who could have similar concerns about privacy during examinations, while maintaining that any similarity in their accounts simply reflected common experiences among immigrant families navigating American healthcare, rather than indicating a pattern of abuse. This partial acknowledgement, while still denying criminal conduct, revealed Webb's recognition that complete denial was becoming untenable as multiple victims with consistent accounts emerged. The psychological pressure intensified as Mitchell presented evidence from Webb's own digital journal, reading selected entries that described his selection criteria for patients and his techniques for creating private examination opportunities. The late afternoon had transitioned to evening outside, the Oregon rain continuing its steady pattern, while inside the interview room, Webb's carefully maintained facade continued to fracture. His breathing became noticeably faster. His hands gripped the table edge until his knuckles whitened, and his responses became increasingly defensive and fragmented. He alternated between claiming the journal was clinical notes misinterpreted out of context and suggesting that investigators were deliberately misconstruing legitimate medical documentation to support a predetermined conclusion. These shifting explanations, each contradicting the previous one, created the impression of someone desperately cycling through potential defenses rather than consistently maintaining innocence. The turning point came when Mitchell confronted Webb with the physical evidence recovered from his home safe. The photographs focusing inappropriately on certain young patients, the small personal items preserved as apparent trophies, and the coded references that corresponded exactly to appointment dates with Maya and other victims. The evening darkness outside was complete now, the interview room's artificial lighting harsh and unforgiving, as Webb stared at the evidence spread before him, the physical manifestation of his crimes that he couldn't explain away with medical terminology or cultural competency arguments. His response marked the most significant moment of the interrogation. "I may have made some judgment errors about appropriate boundaries, but I never intended to harm anyone. I care deeply about my patients." This statement, while still falling short of full confession, represented an implicit acknowledgement that his conduct had crossed boundaries, shifting from complete denial to a defense based on intent and harm rather than claiming his actions were entirely appropriate. Mitchell recognized this as a crucial admission that would undermine any defense strategy based on claiming all his actions were legitimate medical care.
As the interrogation entered its final hours, Webb's demeanor shifted noticeably from defensive justification to visible distress. He spoke about the pressures of medical practice, the emotional demands of caring for vulnerable children, and the complexity of cross-cultural medical care in ways that seemed designed to generate sympathy and reframe his conduct as arising from the stresses of a demanding profession rather than predatory intent. When Mitchell directly asked whether he understood that his actions had harmed the children in his care, Webb's response was telling. A long silence followed by, "I never meant for anyone to feel hurt. Everything I did was from a place of medical commitment." This failure to directly acknowledge harm, combined with his continued focus on his own intentions rather than the impact on victims, revealed the cognitive distortions typical of perpetrators who rationalize abuse as arising from positive motivations. The interrogation concluded after midnight, with Webb declining to answer further questions and requesting to speak with his attorney. As he was returned to his cell, the detective completed detailed reports noting the progression from confident denial to partial acknowledgement of boundary violations, the revealing physical reactions to evidence, and the consistent pattern of reframing abuse as medical care, all elements that would prove valuable in the subsequent prosecution. In the days following Webb's interrogation, his arrest became headline news across Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, with media coverage exploring both the specific allegations and the broader questions about medical professional oversight and immigrant community vulnerability. The Portland rain continued as news crews assembled outside Riverside Children's Medical Center, the Multnomah County Courthouse, and Webb's West Hills home, broadcasting live updates and interviewing shocked community members who had trusted Webb with their children's health care.
The hospital issued carefully worded statements expressing shock at the allegations, emphasizing their cooperation with law enforcement, and announcing the implementation of new protocols for examination room procedures and chaperone policies. The Oregon Medical Board, facing criticism for its inadequate response to the complaint 5 years earlier, announced a comprehensive review of its investigation procedures and promised reforms to ensure similar failures wouldn't occur in the future. Webb's colleagues at the Riverside Pediatric Group released a statement expressing devastation at the allegations and emphasizing that they had no knowledge of any inappropriate conduct, though several would later acknowledge to investigators that they had noticed Webb's unusual patterns with certain patient populations but had attributed them to his dedication to serving underserved communities. The legal consequences extended beyond the criminal charges, as civil litigation quickly materialized. Attorneys representing Maya, Leanne, and Sophia filed detailed complaints against both Webb and Riverside Children's Medical Center, alleging malpractice, negligent supervision, and institutional failure to protect vulnerable patients despite clear warning signs. The lawsuits cited specific instances when concerns had been raised: Thomas Chen's complaint 5 years prior, nursing staff observations of Webb's unusual examination practices, and the pattern of immigrant families requesting to transfer their children's care away from Webb for reasons they weren't comfortable articulating. The civil cases focused on systemic failures that had enabled Webb's continued access to vulnerable patients even after red flags had emerged, seeking both compensation for victims and institutional reforms to prevent similar situations. Riverside's insurance carriers immediately began settlement negotiations, recognizing the strength of the evidence and the devastating impact on the hospital's reputation. By summer 2023, preliminary settlement agreements totaling $18 million had been reached for the 3 identified victims, along with commitments to implement comprehensive reforms, including mandatory chaperone policies, translation services for all medical appointments, and independent oversight of physicians who primarily serve vulnerable populations. For the victims themselves, the conclusion of Webb's interrogation and the progression toward trial marked not an ending, but a transition in their ongoing journey of healing and recovery. Maya Nguyen, now 17, found that the validation of having Webb arrested and charged helped alleviate some of the self-blame she had carried for years, though it also triggered intense anxiety about the upcoming trial where she would have to testify publicly about deeply private violations. Therapist Dr. Sandra Liu, who specialized in medical abuse trauma, worked with Maya and the other victims to help them process their experiences and develop coping strategies. These young women experienced a profound betrayal of trust, Dr. Liu explained in a professional consultation with the prosecution team. Dr. Webb didn't just sexually abuse them, he used his medical authority to frame that abuse as health care, creating confusion about their own perceptions and making them question their right to object. Part of their healing involves reclaiming the authority to judge their own experiences and recognizing that what happened was abuse, not medicine. The therapeutic process focused on helping each victim understand that Webb had deliberately exploited their vulnerability, that his behavior was his responsibility alone, and that their courage in coming forward was protecting other children from similar harm. Marcus Webb's family struggled with their own devastating reality in the aftermath of his arrest. His wife, Elizabeth Webb, a nonprofit executive director, filed for legal separation within weeks of the charges being filed, citing the need to protect their 3 teenage children from the media scrutiny and social stigma attached to Webb's crimes. The family's financial situation deteriorated rapidly as Webb's medical practice income ceased, legal defense costs mounted, and civil settlements loomed. The West Hills home was quietly listed for sale, with the family relocating to a modest apartment in a different neighborhood where they hoped to maintain some anonymity. Webb's children,
aged 13, 15, and 17, struggled with complex emotions: betrayal by a father they had admired, grief for the family life that had been destroyed, and confusion about how to reconcile their memories of a loving parent with the evidence of his predatory behavior. School counselors reported that all three exhibited symptoms of traumatic stress and complicated grief, with the eldest deferring college plans to remain close to siblings during this family crisis. The ripple effects of Webb's crimes extended far beyond his direct victims, devastating his own children and family members who had been entirely unaware of his predatory behavior. The institutional response to the Webb case catalyzed significant changes throughout Oregon's medical system and beyond. The state legislature moved quickly to strengthen oversight of physician conduct, particularly regarding examinations of minors. The Medical Professional Accountability Act, passed in an emergency session in May 2023, mandated stricter chaperone-queries for any examination involving minors and eliminated discretion in reporting complaints of potential sexual misconduct, making all such complaints automatically reportable to the medical board regardless of internal investigation findings, and created an independent patient advocate office within the Oregon Medical Board specifically focused on vulnerable populations, including immigrant families and children.
The legislation also established stronger protections for healthcare workers who reported concerns about colleagues, recognizing that the hierarchical nature of medical settings could inhibit reporting of potential abuse by high-status physicians. The Oregon Health Authority revised its standards for medical facilities, requiring translation services at all pediatric appointments, mandatory training for all staff on recognizing signs of medical professional abuse, and regular audits of examination room practices and patient feedback systems. These reforms, while coming too late for Webb's victims, represented significant progress in addressing systemic vulnerabilities that predatory physicians had exploited. Riverside Children's Medical Center underwent particularly comprehensive changes under new leadership, brought in specifically to restore community trust and implement best practices in child protection. The hospital hired Dr. James Rodriguez, a pediatrician and child safety expert from Seattle, as Chief Patient Safety Officer, with a mandate to completely overhaul examination protocols. Physical changes included renovation of all examination rooms to include interior windows that couldn't be covered, installation of comprehensive surveillance systems in hallways with appropriate privacy protections for actual examinations, and redesign of waiting areas to allow parents better visibility of examination room areas. Procedural changes were even more extensive: mandatory chaperones for all examinations of patients under 16, required translation services for all families with limited English proficiency, implementation of patient feedback systems specifically designed to be accessible to immigrant communities, and creation of a patient advocacy position specifically focused on serving immigrant families and ensuring their concerns were heard and addressed. Most significantly, the hospital implemented a zero-tolerance policy for dismissing patient complaints, requiring full investigation of any concern and mandatory reporting to external authorities regardless of the status or reputation of the physician involved. As summer transitioned to fall in Portland, with the rain returning after a brief dry season, the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office finalized preparations for Webb's trial. Catherine Reynolds and her prosecution team had refined their strategy, focusing on the systematic nature of Webb's targeting of vulnerable immigrant families, the consistency across multiple victims' accounts, and the physical and digital evidence that corroborated those accounts. Expert witnesses had been retained to explain medical abuse patterns, cultural factors that made immigrant families particularly vulnerable to exploitation by physicians, and the psychological impact on child victims of medical professional abuse. The prosecution team recognized that they would face a vigorous defense from Webb's attorneys, who would likely attack the credibility of the child witnesses, suggest cultural misunderstandings rather than abuse, and attempt to reframe Webb's conduct as falling within the bounds of medical discretion, even if somewhat unconventional.
Reynolds prepared for these defense strategies by ensuring her case didn't rely solely on victim testimony, but was buttressed by extensive corroborating evidence, including medical records documenting examination practices that deviated from professional standards, Webb's own journal entries that couldn't be explained as legitimate medical documentation, and expert testimony placing his behavior within established patterns of predatory physician conduct. As fall rain returned to Portland and the trial date approached, the foundational clue of Maya Nguyen's courageous disclosure stood ready to expose the full scope of a predator's decade-long exploitation of vulnerable children and the institutional failures that had enabled his crimes. The trial of Marcus Webb began on a gray November morning in 2023, nearly 8 months after his arrest, with the Multnomah County Circuit Courthouse standing as a testament to justice in downtown Portland. The intense media attention had transformed the case into a flashpoint for discussions about medical professional accountability, immigrant rights in healthcare, and the trust society places in physicians. Satellite trucks lined the streets surrounding the courthouse, and reporters delivered live updates against the backdrop of the historic building's classical architecture. Inside courtroom 413, the atmosphere was tense as potential jurors filed in for selection, many visibly uncomfortable with the prospect of serving on such a disturbing case involving the sexual abuse of children by a trusted physician. Judge Raymond Morrison, a veteran jurist known for his careful management of complex cases and commitment to ensuring fair trials, presided over the proceedings with gravity that reflected the seriousness of the charges. The Portland rain created a melancholy soundtrack, tapping against the courthouse windows as jury selection proceeded. At the defense table, Marcus Webb sat beside his attorneys, a high-powered legal team led by prominent criminal defense lawyer Michael Sterling, known for representing physicians in medical misconduct cases. Webb's appearance had been carefully crafted for trial: conservative dark suit, neutral tie, and wire-rimmed glasses that emphasized his professional background rather than his current status as an accused child abuser.
Jury selection proceeded over 4 days, with prosecutor Catherine Reynolds and defense attorney Sterling engaged in careful evaluation of potential jurors who could fairly evaluate evidence in such an emotionally charged case. The persistent Portland rain continued as prospective jurors were questioned about their attitudes toward the medical profession, experiences with healthcare providers, preconceptions about immigrant communities' vulnerability, and ability to set aside media coverage they might have encountered. Reynolds sought jurors who would be receptive to expert testimony about predatory physician behavior and the specific vulnerabilities of immigrant families navigating American healthcare systems, while Sterling attempted to identify jurors who might be skeptical of child testimony or open to alternative explanations for Webb's examination practices that didn't involve criminal intent. The process eventually yielded a jury of 8 women and 4 men with 2 alternates, representing a cross-section of the Portland metropolitan area, a diverse group that included a retired social worker, an engineer, a small business owner, a librarian, several parents of school-aged children, and members of Portland's immigrant communities who brought personal understanding of the cultural dynamics at play in the case. Judge Morrison administered the oath to the selected jurors, emphasizing their responsibility to evaluate evidence objectively, and reminding them that the defendant was presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial officially began with opening statements on November 13, 2023, with the courtroom filled, capacity and overflow rooms established for additional media observers and community members who wanted to witness the proceedings. The gray Portland morning light filtered through tall windows as prosecutor Catherine Reynolds approached the jury box, her expression reflecting the gravity of the case she was about to present. "This case is about the betrayal of trust," Reynolds began, her voice clear and measured in the hushed courtroom. "The profound betrayal that occurs when someone in a position of medical authority, someone we are taught from childhood to trust without question, exploits that authority to sexually abuse vulnerable children under the guise of providing health care." She outlined how the evidence would show that Marcus Webb had systematically identified, isolated, and abused at least 3 patients over a period spanning more than a decade, using his position as a respected pediatrician to access victims and his medical expertise to frame abuse as legitimate medical care.
The prosecutor methodically previewed the evidence the jury would see. Medical records showing Webb's pattern of targeting immigrant families with limited English proficiency, appointment schedules revealing suspicious patterns of frequent visits and extended examination times, physical evidence recovered from his home, including inappropriate photographs and personal items taken from victims, digital evidence from his devices, including the journal documenting his victim selection process, expert testimony about predatory physician behaviors and immigrant family vulnerabilities, and most importantly, the testimony of the victims themselves. Reynolds concluded by emphasizing the foundational element that had broken the case open. Maya and Gwyn found the courage, after 7 years of suffering in silence, to tell the truth about what Dr. Webb had done to her. That single act of courage led to the discovery of a predatory pattern that had continued for over a decade, hidden behind the white coat and professional credentials of a man who had taken an oath to do no harm. Defense attorney Michael Sterling presented a starkly different narrative in his opening statement, portraying Marcus Webb as a dedicated physician whose culturally sensitive approach to caring for immigrant families had been tragically misinterpreted. The Portland rain intensified outside as Sterling paced before the jury, his voice resonating with conviction on behalf of his client. He characterized the case as a devastating misunderstanding fueled by cultural differences in medical expectations, language barriers that led to misinterpretation of legitimate medical procedures, and overzealous investigators who had suggested abuse to impressionable children rather than conducting objective inquiry. He emphasized Webb's credentials from Johns Hopkins, his years of dedication to serving underserved populations, his volunteer work in immigrant communities, and his previously unblemished career. He suggested that Webb's frequent appointments with certain patients reflected thorough, conscientious medical care for children with complex health needs, that his requests for parental absence during examinations followed contemporary pediatric standards for respecting adolescent privacy, and that any physical contact had been appropriate medical examination framed within cultural contexts that immigrant families might not fully understand. The defense attorney attacked the reliability of the victims' accounts, suggesting their memories had been influenced by investigators' questions, media coverage, and the passage of time since the alleged events. Sterling concluded by urging the jury to maintain skepticism about the prosecution's narrative and remember that the burden of proof rested entirely with the state, a burden he claimed they could possibly not meet, given what he characterized as the absence of objective evidence documenting abuse and the questionable reliability of testimony from young witnesses whose perceptions might have been shaped by cultural misunderstandings and suggestive questioning. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Detective Sarah Mitchell, who provided comprehensive overview of the investigation that had led to Webb's arrest. The afternoon rain created patterns on the courthouse windows as Mitchell detailed how Maya and Gwyn's disclosure had triggered an investigation that quickly uncovered a pattern of predatory behavior spanning over a decade.
The detective described the evidence recovered during searches of Webb's home, office, and electronic devices. The coded journal documenting his selection of vulnerable patients. The collection of personal items apparently taken as trophies from victims. The inappropriate photographs that violated medical photography ethics, and the records showing his deliberate targeting of immigrant families with limited English proficiency. Using digital displays visible to the jury and gallery, Mitchell walked through timeline charts and evidence photographs, establishing the methodical nature of both Webb's predatory behavior and the subsequent investigation. Her testimony included detailed accounts of her interviews with all 3 identified victims, emphasizing the striking consistency in their descriptions of Webb's grooming process and abuse, despite their having no contact with each other and their experiences occurring years apart. Sterling's cross-examination of Mitchell was aggressive, suggesting the detective had approached the case with presumption of guilt and had asked leading questions that influenced the victim's statements. Mitchell maintained her professional composure throughout,
acknowledging standard investigatory procedures while firmly defending the integrity of the investigation and the measures taken to avoid contaminating witness testimony through the use of forensic interview protocols specifically designed for medical abuse cases. The prosecution's case continued with hospital personnel testifying about Webb's practices at Riverside Children's Medical Center and the institutional failures that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. The Portland morning brought temporary relief from rain as Thomas Chen took the stand, his voice tight with controlled emotion as he described his complaint from 5 years earlier about Webb's examination of his daughter Jessica. Chen testified that he had raised specific concerns with both hospital administrators and the Oregon Medical Board about Webb's insistence on examining Jessica alone, the duration of appointments that seemed excessive for routine checkups, and his daughter's increasing reluctance to see Webb, despite having no medical reason to avoid necessary care. He produced copies of his detailed written complaint to the hospital and the dismissive responses he had received, which suggested his concerns arose from cultural differences in medical privacy expectations, rather than legitimate red flags about physician behavior. Chen's voice broke as he described his feelings upon learning that Webb had indeed been abusing children, and that his complaint 5 years earlier, if properly investigated, might have prevented subsequent victims. "I knew something was wrong. A father knows. But they told me I didn't understand American medical practices, that Dr. Webb was one of their best physicians. They made me feel like I was the problem for questioning him." This testimony was devastating to both Webb and the hospital, revealing systemic failures in responding to concerns raised by immigrant families whose cultural deference to medical authority and language barriers had been exploited by both the predator and the institution that enabled him. The courtroom fell completely silent as Maya Nguyen, now 17, took the witness stand on the trial's 5th day, the Portland rain creating a soft background sound through the courthouse's old windows. Reynolds had prepared the jury for Maya's testimony, explaining that they would hear directly from the young woman whose courage had finally exposed Webb's pattern of abuse, and asking them to consider the difficulty of testifying about such personal violations, particularly for someone from a culture that emphasized not bringing shame to the family. Maya appeared nervous but determined as she was sworn in, her voice initially quiet, but growing stronger as she began to describe her experiences as Webb's patient from age 9 to 16. She testified about how Webb had initially seemed kind and attentive, making her feel special with his attention and concern for her asthma, before gradually introducing examination procedures that made her uncomfortable, but which he framed as necessary medical care for her condition. Maya described the progression from medical examinations that felt slightly uncomfortable to clearly inappropriate touching that Webb continued to characterize as thorough respiratory assessment or checking for proper physical development. Her testimony included specific details about the examination room where most abuse occurred, the medical justifications Webb provided for examining her without her parents present, and the implicit threats he used to ensure her silence, particularly his suggestions that questioning a doctor's medical judgment could result in her family losing access to health care or facing immigration problems. The specificity of Maya's account, her clear descriptions of the examination room layout and procedures, and her ability to articulate which aspects had felt wrong, even when Webb was telling her they were normal medical care, created a powerful impression on the jury. Several jurors took extensive notes during her testimony, and one was observed wiping tears as Maya described finally disclosing the abuse to her school counselor after years of carrying the burden alone. Defense attorney Sterling faced the delicate task of cross-examining Maya without appearing to attack a sympathetic teenager, a challenge made more difficult by the jury's visible emotional response to her direct testimony. The afternoon rain had resumed as Sterling approached the witness stand with a deliberately gentle demeanor, focusing his questions on potential inconsistencies in Maya's accounts over time, and suggesting that cultural differences might have led her to misinterpret legitimate medical procedures. He questioned Maya about her parents' limited English skills and their unfamiliarity with American medical norms, implying this might have created confusion about what constituted appropriate examination procedures. Sterling also explored the timing of Maya's disclosure, suggesting that the health education unit at her school might have influenced her interpretation of past medical care, essentially planting ideas about abuse that she then retrofitted to her memories of Webb's examinations. Throughout this questioning, Maya maintained remarkable composure, acknowledging when she couldn't remember minor details while firmly maintaining the core elements of her account. Reynolds objected several times when Sterling's questions became inappropriate or speculative, with Judge Morrison sustaining most objections and reminding the defense attorney to maintain appropriate boundaries with the teenage witness. The cross-examination ultimately seemed to strengthen rather than undermine Maya's credibility, as her consistency on key points, despite challenging questioning, made a visible impression on the jury. The testimony of Dr. Robert Chen, the forensic psychiatrist specializing in medical professional abuse, provided crucial scientific framework for understanding Webb's predatory behavior patterns. The Portland afternoon had brought clearing skies, unusual for November, as Dr. Chen explained the concept of medical grooming, the process by which physicians who abuse patients exploit the inherent power imbalance in the doctor-patient relationship, use medical authority to frame abuse as legitimate care, and select victims based on vulnerability factors that make them less likely to report or be believed. Using clear language and occasional visual aids, he described how Webb's behavior as documented in evidence and victim testimony represented textbook predatory physician patterns. The selection of patients from immigrant families with language barriers and cultural unfamiliarity with American healthcare systems, the creation of medical justifications for frequent appointments and examinations without parental presence, the gradual escalation of inappropriate contact framed as necessary medical procedures, and the use of both medical authority and implicit threats to ensure compliance and silence. This expert testimony provided crucial context for understanding both Webb's methodical approach to abusing children in his care and the victims' responses, including their delayed disclosure and continuing psychological impact. As the prosecution continued building its case, digital forensics expert James Park testified about the evidence recovered from Webb's electronic devices, providing technical analysis that supported the narrative of calculated predatory behavior. The Portland evening brought renewed rain as Park explained to the jury how he had decoded Webb's encrypted journal using forensic software, revealing entries that documented his selection criteria for potential victims and his techniques for creating examination opportunities away from oversight. Using carefully redacted excerpts displayed on screens, Park showed how Webb had maintained detailed notes about certain patients that went far beyond legitimate medical documentation, including observations about their families' vulnerabilities, assessments of which children seemed most compliant or unlikely to disclose, and reflections on his examination techniques. Park explained the significance of timestamps and metadata, showing that Webb had often accessed or modified these encrypted files immediately before or after appointments with the children in question, establishing clear connections between his digital behavior and his physical access to victims. The technical testimony was balanced with clear explanations that helped the jury understand its relevance to the broader case. Sterling's cross-examination attempted to suggest that the journal could represent clinical notes or research observations misinterpreted by investigators, but Park's confident responses, backed by his extensive credentials, and the obviously inappropriate content of the entries, seemed to make a strong impression on the jury that this was documentation of predatory behavior,
not legitimate medical record-keeping. The first week of trial concluded with testimony from nursing staff who had worked with Webb at Riverside Children's Medical Center. providing crucial evidence of his unusual practices and the red flags that had been ignored or rationalized away. Nurse Maria Rodriguez described observing Webb's pattern of scheduling longer appointment blocks for certain patients, primarily from immigrant families, and his consistent requests that she attend to other patients or administrative tasks during these extended appointments. Dr. Webb would specifically ask me to give him privacy with certain patients, saying they had sensitive issues to discuss or needed thorough examinations that would be uncomfortable with a nurse present, Rodriguez testified, her voice tight with guilt about not recognizing these as warning signs. At the time, I accepted his explanations because he was a senior physician with an excellent reputation. But looking back, I realized he was systematically creating opportunities to be alone with vulnerable children. She described instances when she had knocked on examination room doors during these long appointments, and Webb had seemed irritated by the interruption, sometimes taking several minutes to open the door. Other nursing staff provided similar testimony about Webb's unusual patterns, creating a picture of a physician who had carefully manipulated hospital routines and staff assignments to create regular opportunities for private access to selected victims. The prosecution concluded the first week by calling Dr. Patricia Holbrook, Riverside's chief medical officer, whose testimony about the hospital's inadequate investigation of Thomas Chen's complaint proved deeply damaging to the institutional defendants in the civil cases and reinforced the prosecution's narrative of systemic failure. The Friday afternoon rain streaked down courthouse windows as Holbrook, appearing visibly uncomfortable, acknowledged that the hospital's investigation of Chen's complaint had been insufficient, consisting primarily of accepting Webb's explanations without independent verification, consulting outside experts, or reviewing his examination practices with other patients. She admitted under Reynolds's pointed questioning that the hospital had prioritized protecting Webb's reputation and avoiding potential liability over thoroughly investigating potential abuse, a decision she now deeply regretted. As court adjourned for the weekend, the prosecution had established a compelling narrative of a physician who had systematically exploited his position to abuse vulnerable children, hidden behind professional credentials and cultural authority, while institutions that should have protected his victims instead protected him. The Portland sunset brought momentary color to the gray skies as journalists delivered their end-of-week reports outside the courthouse, summarizing the powerful testimony from victims, experts, and witnesses that had dominated the first week of trial. The second week of Marcus Webb's trial began with testimony from Ling Tran, the second victim to come forward following Maya's disclosure. Now 12 years old, Leng approached the witness stand with visible apprehension, accompanied by a victim advocate who remained nearby throughout her testimony. The Monday morning Portland rain created a melancholy atmosphere as Leng was sworn in, her voice barely audible as she promised to tell the truth. Prosecutor Reynolds approached with exceptional gentleness, establishing rapport through simple questions about school and hobbies, before gradually guiding Leng through her account of being Webb's patient for diabetes management. Ling's testimony revealed a pattern strikingly similar to Maya's: Webb's initial presentation as a caring physician, his creation of medical justifications for frequent monitoring appointments, his insistence on examining her alone despite her young age and her parents' limited ability to advocate for their daughter due to language barriers, and the progression from uncomfortable medical procedures to clearly inappropriate touching that Webb continued to frame as necessary diabetes care. The teenager described how Webb had told her that checking her physical development was important for managing diabetes and that privacy was necessary for her to feel comfortable during sensitive examinations. Medical rationalizations that her Vietnamese immigrant parents, with their limited English and deference to medical authority, had accepted without question. Ling's testimony included specific details about Webb's examination room procedures and the items he kept in certain drawers that corroborated both Maya's account and the physical evidence recovered during searches. Her voice grew steadier as she described finally feeling able to come forward after learning Maya had disclosed, realizing she wasn't alone in her experiences, and that what Webb had done was indeed abuse rather than legitimate medical care as he had claimed. The emotional impact of Lang's testimony was visible throughout the courtroom, with several jurors appearing visibly affected by her account. Defense attorney Sterling's cross-examination was notably restrained, recognizing the risks of aggressively questioning such a young witness. He focused on suggesting that language barriers between Lang's family and Webb might have created misunderstandings about examination procedures, but Lang's clear testimony about specific acts that couldn't be explained by miscommunication undermined this defense strategy. Reynolds's redirect examination effectively addressed Sterling's suggestions by having Lang describe in clinical detail exactly what Webb had done, leaving no room for interpretation of these acts as anything other than sexual abuse. The prosecution's case gained additional momentum with testimony from Sophia Morales, now 15, who described being abused by Webb 6 years earlier during treatment for childhood diabetes. The Portland afternoon brought intermittent sunshine breaking through clouds. As Sophia, composed and articulate despite the difficult subject matter, recounted how Webb had exploited her family's limited English proficiency and their gratitude for his willingness to provide care despite their uncertain immigration status. She described how Webb had created opportunities to examine her alone by scheduling appointments during school hours when her parents couldn't accompany her, positioning these visits as accommodations for a hard-working family, rather than opportunities to isolate her victim. Her testimony included specific details about the progression of abuse and Webb's threats that questioning his medical authority could result in her family being reported to immigration officials, a particularly effective silencing tactic for a family with mixed legal status. The consistency across all three victims' accounts, despite years between their experiences and no contact with each other, created a devastating portrait of Webb's calculated approach to selecting, isolating, and victimizing vulnerable children whose family circumstances made them particularly unlikely to report abuse or navigate the complex medical complaint system successfully. Dr. Sandra Liu, the psychologist specializing in medical abuse trauma, provided expert testimony on the specific grooming and manipulation tactics used by physicians who abuse patients. The Portland rain had resumed as Dr. Liu methodically explained how Webb's behavior aligned with established patterns of predatory medical professional conduct. Using accessible language and visual aids, she described the phases of medical abuse: identification of vulnerable patients, creation of medical justifications for frequent contact and private examinations, gradual introduction of inappropriate contact framed as medical necessity, and maintenance of access through a combination of authority and threats. Dr. Liu explained how predators in medical settings exploit not just their professional authority, but also patients' and families' fundamental trust in healthcare providers, cultural factors that discourage questioning medical authority, and language barriers that prevent effective communication about concerns. She also addressed the common psychological impact on victims of medical abuse, helping the jury understand why children often delay disclosure and how the effects manifest in behavioral and emotional issues, information that provided context for understanding the experiences described by Maya, Leanne, and Sophia in their testimony. The prosecution's case reached a critical juncture with testimony from former Riverside Medical Director Dr. James Wilson, who had reviewed Webb's patient files and appointment patterns at the request of investigators.
The midweek Portland morning brought clearing weather as Dr. Wilson, a pediatrician with 30 years of experience, provided damning analysis of Webb's medical practices. Dr. Webb's examination frequency and duration patterns with certain patients had no legitimate medical justification, Wilson testified, his professional authority lending weight to his conclusions. The appointments were far more frequent than standard protocols for the conditions being treated. The examination procedures documented in his notes were not medically necessary, and his insistence on excluding parents from examinations of young children violated contemporary pediatric standards. Wilson methodically walked the jury through specific examples, comparing Webb's practices with standard pediatric protocols and highlighting how his examination techniques departed from accepted medical practice in ways that served no legitimate medical purpose but created ideal conditions for abuse. He also testified about the previous complaint investigation, noting that the Hospital Review Committee had failed to consult external pediatric experts or compare Webb's practices to professional standards, failures that allowed him to continue operating despite clear deviations from appropriate medical care. Sterling's cross-examination attempted to suggest that medical practice involves professional judgment and that standards allow for variation. But Wilson firmly testified that the patterns in Webb's practice went beyond normal variation into territory that no reasonable pediatrician could defend as legitimate medical care. The prosecution presented testimony from immigration attorney Rosa Gonzalez, who explained the specific vulnerabilities faced by immigrant families navigating American healthcare systems. The Portland afternoon rain created a backdrop as Gonzalez described how families with limited English proficiency, unfamiliarity with American medical norms, and concerns about immigration status are particularly vulnerable to exploitation by predatory professionals. She testified about the power dynamics that make immigrant families reluctant to question authority figures, the language barriers that prevent effective communication about concerns, and the very real fears about immigration consequences that can be exploited by perpetrators to ensure victim silence. Dr. Webb specifically targeted these vulnerabilities, Gonzalez testified. His threats about immigration consequences, his exploitation of language barriers, and his abuse of cultural deference to medical authority represent a sophisticated understanding of how to select and silence victims from immigrant communities. This testimony provided crucial context for understanding why Maya, Leanne, and Sophia had remained silent for so long, and why their families had not questioned Webb's practices despite their children's visible distress about medical appointments. The most dramatic moment of the second week came with testimony about the inappropriate photographs and personal items recovered from Webb's home safe. Forensic analyst Carlin Martinez described the discovery of these materials and their significance as evidence of predatory behavior. The Thursday afternoon rain renewed as Martinez explained how the photographs, while not explicitly sexual, showed inappropriate focus on certain young patients and included images that had no legitimate medical purpose but appeared to serve Webb's personal interests. More disturbing were the personal items, a small necklace, a hair ribbon, a keychain, each preserved in plastic bags with dates and the victim's initials. These items represent trophies. Their personal belongings taken from victims and preserved as mementos of the abuse, a behavior pattern commonly observed in serial predators who use physical items to relive their crimes. She identified items that Maya and Leanne confirmed had belonged to them and had gone missing after appointments with Webb, providing tangible physical evidence connecting Webb to his victims in ways that corroborated their testimony. Sterling's attempts to suggest innocent explanations for these items, that patients might have forgotten them and Webb saved them to return, rang hollow when confronted with the deliberate preservation, hidden storage, and coded labeling that clearly indicated these were souvenirs rather than lost property being held for return. The prosecution concluded the second week with powerful testimony from Maya's mother, Teen Gwen, speaking through an interpreter about her family's trust in Webb and their devastation upon learning he had abused their daughter. The Friday afternoon rain intensified as Mrs. Nguyen described how they had specifically sought out Webb because of his reputation for caring for immigrant families, how they had been grateful for his attention to Maya's asthma care, and how they had never questioned his requests to examine Maya alone because they trusted his medical judgment completely. She broke as she described learning the truth. Dr. Webb used our trust, our language barriers, our respect for doctors. He used everything about us to hurt our daughter. We brought her to him to be healed, and instead he harmed her in ways we are still discovering. The raw emotion of a mother's testimony about unknowingly delivering her child into a predator's care created a powerful conclusion to the prosecution's case in chief, emphasizing the profound betrayal represented by Webb's exploitation of the immigrant families who had placed their complete trust in his medical authority. As the second week concluded, the prosecution had presented overwhelming evidence of systematic predatory behavior. Consistent victim testimony, corroborated by physical evidence, digital records, expert analysis, and institutional witnesses who confirmed Webb's deviation from medical standards. The Portland evening brought darkness early, as it does in November, with rain continuing to fall on a city awaiting the defense's response to the damning case presented against Dr. Marcus Webb.
The defense case began on Monday of the third week, with Sterling calling character witnesses attempting to present Webb as a dedicated physician whose practices had been misunderstood. The Portland morning brought fog rolling in from the Willamette River as former patients and their parents testified about positive experiences with Webb's care, his patience with nervous children, and his advocacy for immigrant health access. These witnesses described Webb's volunteer work at free clinics, his donations to community health programs, and his efforts to recruit more Vietnamese and Latino medical staff to better serve Portland's diverse communities. However, Reynolds' cross-examinations consistently exposed the limitations of these testimonies. None of these character witnesses had observed Webb's examination practices during the private appointments where abuse occurred. Their experiences had been during routine visits with parents present, and their positive impressions were based on Webb's carefully constructed public persona rather than knowledge of his private conduct. The prosecution effectively demonstrated that predatory professionals deliberately cultivate positive public reputations specifically to provide cover for their abuse, a pattern that Webb's case exemplified. The defense's attempt to present expert testimony challenging the prosecution's case largely backfired. Sterling called Dr. Nathan Pierce, a pediatrician and consultant, who attempted to suggest that Webb's examination practices, while perhaps unconventional, could fall within the range of acceptable medical judgment. The Portland afternoon rain resumed as Dr. Pierce testified that medical practice involves professional discretion and that cultural factors might influence appropriate examination techniques for immigrant families. However, Reynolds' devastating cross-examination forced Dr. Pierce to acknowledge that he had not reviewed the specific details of Webb's examination procedures as documented in victim statements, had not reviewed Webb's patient records or appointment patterns, and was speaking in theoretical generalities rather than defending Webb's specific conduct. When Reynolds walked Dr. Pierce through the actual examination techniques described by victims, he was forced to concede that these specific acts had no legitimate medical justification and violated professional standards. By the conclusion of his testimony, the defense's own expert had effectively confirmed that Webb's conduct constituted abuse rather than medical care, significantly undermining Sterling's strategy. In a decision that surprised many observers, Sterling chose not to have Webb testify in his own defense, recognizing that the extensive evidence against him made cross-examination too risky. After careful consideration of all strategic factors, Dr. Webb will exercise his constitutional right not to testify, Sterling informed the court. Protecting Webb from Reynolds' cross-examination, but also meaning the jury would never hear his explanation or see his demeanor under questioning. This decision eliminated any possibility of Webb expressing remorse or humanizing himself to the jury, leaving them with only the cold evidence of his calculated predatory behavior. The defense rested its case after just 2 days of testimony, having failed to effectively counter the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. Closing arguments began on Wednesday morning, with Reynolds methodically reviewing the evidence for the jury. The Portland rain created steady background sound as the prosecutors summarized 3 weeks of testimony and evidence, consistent accounts from 3 victims spanning different time periods, physical evidence, including Webb's journal and the items taken from victims, digital evidence showing his targeting of vulnerable families, medical expert testimony confirming his practices violated professional standards, and institutional testimony revealing warning signs that had been ignored. Marcus Webb exploited every vulnerability these families had: their language barriers, their cultural deference to medical authority, their immigration concerns, their trust in a physician who claimed to care about serving their communities. He weaponized his medical degree to abuse children, framing sexual assault as health care and using his professional reputation to ensure no one would believe these children if they spoke up. But Maya Nguyen found the courage to speak anyway, and her truth led to the discovery of a pattern of predatory behavior that Dr. Webb had carefully hidden for over a decade. The evidence is overwhelming. Justice demands guilty verdicts on all counts. Sterling's closing argument emphasized reasonable doubt and cultural misunderstanding, suggesting that legitimate medical care had been misinterpreted through lenses of cultural difference and investigative presumption of guilt. But his argument seemed to fall flat against the weight of the evidence, particularly Webb's own journal entries and the physical items taken from victims that couldn't be explained by cultural misunderstanding. The defense attorney's final appeal, asking jurors to consider whether they could be absolutely certain beyond any doubt, subtly mischaracterized the reasonable doubt standard in ways that Judge Morrison would correct in his jury instructions. Judge Morrison's instructions to the jury carefully explained the legal standards they must apply, the elements of each charge, and the proper definition of reasonable doubt. The Thursday afternoon had brought clearer weather, as the judge emphasized that they must base verdicts solely on evidence presented and law as instructed, setting aside sympathy, bias, or external information. As the jury retired to begin deliberations, the packed courtroom settled into anxious waiting. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days, requesting to review certain key pieces of evidence, including Webb's journal entries, the photographs and items from his safe, and video recordings of the victim's testimony. The relatively brief deliberation period, given the complexity of the case and the 48 separate counts, suggested strong consensus among jurors. On Saturday afternoon, November 25th, word spread that a verdict had been reached, bringing parties rushing back to the courthouse. The courtroom filled quickly as the jury filed in, their expressions revealing nothing. Judge Morrison asked if they had reached verdicts on all counts, receiving confirmation from the foreperson. As the clerk read the verdicts, guilty on count after count, all 48 felonies, Maya, Leanne, and Sophia embraced their families, tears of relief and vindication flowing freely. Webb sat motionless, the reality of spending the remainder of his life in prison seemingly not yet fully registered. The unanimous guilty verdicts on all counts represented complete rejection of the defense's theories and total validation of the victim's courage in coming forward. In the aftermath of the verdicts, victim impact statements at sentencing revealed the devastating effects of Webb's abuse. Maya described years of nightmares, panic attacks, and difficulty trusting anyone in positions of authority. Leanne spoke about how Webb had stolen her childhood's sense of safety and security. Sophia described the shame she still carried and the ongoing therapy needed to process the trauma. Judge Morrison, in pronouncing sentence, characterized Webb's crimes as representing the most profound betrayal of the sacred trust between physician and patient, made even more egregious by his deliberate targeting of vulnerable children, whose families' circumstances made them least able to protect themselves or seek justice. The judge sentenced Webb to 30 years on each count related to each victim, 90 years total to be served consecutively, effectively ensuring he would die in prison. Your actions represent not just individual crimes, but a systematic exploitation of some of our community's most vulnerable members, Morrison stated. You weaponized your medical training, your professional reputation, and the trust society places in physicians to sexually abuse children. There can be no greater betrayal of the medical profession's fundamental principle: first, do no harm. As Webb was led from the courtroom in shackles, Maya Nguyen stood with her mother, therapist, and victim advocate, watching the man who had abused her for 7 years finally face consequences. Her courage in breaking silence had not only brought her own abuser to justice, but had exposed systemic failures in medical oversight and immigrant family protection, catalyzing reforms that would protect countless other children. The Portland rain had stopped, and weak November sunshine broke through the clouds as the verdict's meaning settled over those gathered. Justice, while imperfect and unable to undo harm, had been served. And the foundational clue, one brave teenager's decision to finally speak her truth, had illuminated a darkness that too many institutions had chosen to ignore, ensuring that Marcus Webb's betrayal of medical ethics and exploitation of vulnerable children would finally end.